Hi, my name is David McDermott, and I'll be walking through Security First principles, specifically least privilege. What are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to do a refresher of all the different security principles, and we're going to specifically dive into least privilege. We're going to walk through our history of it, concepts, and really why should we care and how do we build that into our processes. Thinking about cybersecurity first is really important because a lot of these principles can be harder to implement if they're not thought of up front. So you want these built into your system design and make those decisions of where you want to put additional emphasis on different types of security based upon the needs that you have. If you go right back and try to put all of these in there, some of them will be very challenging depending on how things have been implemented. So these are two of our first concepts, domain separation and process isolation. Both of them are relatively similar. They really are meant to be keeping things apart from each other so they don't stomp on each other. Processes are running in their own space. Things like operating system, if you're running virtual servers and having two of those running, one server crashing in a virtual environment shouldn't bring down the other. Same with domain separation. We want to keep domains separated and so they don't interact with each other. And then that will come into abstraction down the road. Resource encapsulation and modularity. We want all of our resources encapsulated into one self-contained operating area. That gives us the ability to send that off and have it run without a whole lot of dependencies being put together. This also ties into modularity. If we have everything encapsulated, we should be able to change one process for another. So if we have a program, for instance, for printing, and we want to change that out, we should be able to change that using modularity and having those encapsulated into one driver package. Same with layering and abstraction. You can get into inversion of control from software development principles, where each layer really doesn't know a whole lot about the other layer, except for brief information around it. Say we have long division as an action. We really don't need to know all the details about how to do that. We really just need to know that there's a function called divide. We don't need to dive into all of the numerical analysis that goes into it, especially if we get into things like solving for linear algebra and we want to get eigenvalues or things like that. We really should probably have a concept of how it was done so we know we're using the right method, but we don't need to go rebuilding all of those things every time. That's what abstraction would allow us to do. There would be a method called something like eigenvalue to return that. Similar with layering. If we need to get that value and return it in a web app, that should just come back from the web API. It doesn't need all of that additional information. That goes back to some of those previous steps with modularity. We could change how that's built out then and call a different implementation for speed or better accuracy or things like that based upon how we need that to be done. Data hiding is also tied into that. We really don't need to know all the nuts and bolts of how data is stored. I want it to perform, and I may have functional requirements for how fast that data needs to be done, but I don't necessarily care whether it's stored on a hard disk, flash storage, or put on a tape disk, for instance. What I do want to know is that it's backed up, and I set up some of those things for myself as functional requirements, but then it's on the provider or the system to handle that data for me. Simplicity uses that nice, friendly model, KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. We don't want to have a whole lot of additional information put into something because be kind to your future self. The more complexity you put into there, may not even be someone else. It can be yourself debugging that down the road. That new creative, novel, hard to solve thing, if you make it so complicated and a clever one-liner, you may not know how to fix that later. So make that simple on yourself and make sure the documentation is as self-documenting as possible. This goes back to kind of those previous ones about keeping it simple. We don't need an unnecessarily complex system. Don't use things that remove deprecated features that aren't being used. It minimizes your attack vectors and it makes things easier to use. And that's very important when you start to try to figure out how to solve problems. Now we get into least privilege. How long has this been around? Almost 50 years. Let's look at one of the first concepts using this. Every program and every privileged user of the system should operate using the least amount of privilege necessary to complete the job. Written in 1974. That's been around a long time. So what does that do? Going back to that definition before, don't give them more access than they need to do their job. It's a simple concept, but it can be hard to split up your system that way. We're going to go through a business system example using a human resources system. How do we grant permissions to different users? We're going to have things in there like vacations, financials, raises, PII for submitting for tax records, and all kinds of information there. If we wanted to make this system super easy from a security standpoint, we just grant everyone access to all of the same things. But even if you trust most of your employees, suddenly they click in there and they can see differences in raises, vacations, and all kinds of things, or potentially see KPIs of company financials that they don't have the concept around. It can cause concern and frustration around the company. So let's take a step past this. We know that we can't just give everyone everything, so what should we do? How do we start dividing this? Let's think of the different types of users that we have. We could have accounting users. They could be department heads, they could be supervisors, we could have our standard employees, we can have payroll. Those are just a few of the different roles that we have. So let's think through and how we can differentiate those. Basic employees really don't need much more than being able to do their job. So in a human resources system, they're really not going to do much. They can probably submit their vacation, see how much vacation they have, see some key information about how well they're doing, and see their paychecks and tax information. Well, then they have their supervisor. We know they're going to be able to do a lot of the same things as a standard employee, so submitting vacation, seeing paychecks, taxes, things like that. But they also need to be able to improve their employees' vacation and see information about their employees and how they fit into how they fit from the median for salaries and key indicators to help with retention. Then we get into our department heads. These can be differentiated based upon those that, say, an accounting department head. They're going to need to be able to see all kinds of information across everyone. But something like an IT manager department head, they may only need to know all of the drill down information for their department. They may be able to compare themselves to other departments by percentage of budget utilized in different KPIs like that, but they may not need the ability to drill down and see everyone's salaries in different departments. Then we get into somebody whose primary job is looking at financial information about employees, things like accounting. So they need to be able to see salary and help with retention across the company. They also need to be able to run reports across the company to see if vacation's being utilized, who's overspending, what are the cost centers tied to that, and how are people managing their budget. But they also would have supervisors within this department. So they would need to do the standard HR functions of vacation, approval, tracking, all of those types of things. But you could also have somebody who's in accounting that isn't a supervisor, so they may not need all of that same information. So what we've really been kind of talking about there is something called RBAC, Role-Based Access Control. What that means is we're going to grant privilege by the role. So this helps when employees are switching jobs, we can change their roles and cascade those functionality that they need within the application. This makes it a whole lot easier to audit and check through that. You can send a list off to a supervisor of here's the list of your employees and here are the roles they have. If somebody is no longer in that role that they should have, say somebody transferred from accounting into IT, maybe they don't need the same roles that they had before, and those should be cleaned up. Doing that by role allows for that auditing and ease of use much better. So really what we're talking about is just grant what people need to be able to do their job. This can be physical security, software security, or all kinds of different types. Maybe you have a server room in your building. All IT probably doesn't need access to that. You may have some system admins that need access to that to do their job, so you wouldn't want to grant all IHE access to the server room, but you may have sysadmin roles that should have access to that. This can also be something like PII, human resources employees, should be able to see the social security number for being able to help with tax audits and things of that nature. But others may not need that whole information, but still need something to verify against when they're in HR. So maybe they need the last 4 of the social to be able to help that. Setting this up based upon role access can help with doing data masking policies, auditing, tracking, and all types of scenarios within that. As you can see, if you break these up into different roles and start building that through personas or other opportunities, that makes it a whole lot easier to know that your system's functioning as you expect. Within our lab, we'll have a diagram within Excel where you can look at those roles and start to break those down based upon the functionality that they need to operate. Please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.